This government does not turn to the notwithstanding clause unless the stakes warrant it. And in this case, the stakes could not be higher. This is one of the most consequential actions our government will take during our time in office.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is the gutsiest conservative politician in the country, and she is taking enormous flack for it as well. Last week, she announced that her United Conservative government will be using the Notwithstanding clause to ensure that three key pieces of legislation, a ban on sex change treatments for minors, a ban on males in female sports, and a bill requiring parental consent for LGBT content in education, remain law and are implemented in Alberta. Here is what she said about her use of the Notwithstanding clause at a recent press conference.
Bill 9 will invoke the Canadian Charter's Notwithstanding clause and to amend and uphold three critical pieces of legislation without further court delay or uncertainty. This government does not turn to the Notwithstanding clause unless the stakes warrant it. And in this case, the stakes could not be higher. This is one of the most consequential actions our government will take during our time in office. These measures reflect the views of an overwhelming majority of Albertans, and it is our responsibility to make sure that they are not overturned. This is not a hypothetical discussion. This suite of legislation is in active litigation right now. At this moment, we have three lawsuits working their way through the courts with one injunction in place. These lawsuits could take years to resolve, including possible appeals to the Supreme Court. These delays are not acceptable to this government when children are in harm's way.
So that was a fantastic and firm statement. She is essentially saying the precise opposite of what the LGBT activists, the media, the Liberal Party, the NDP, and others are saying, which is that if you do not ban sex change surgeries, you put children at risk. And she's absolutely right. She made another comment in a press release about the Notwithstanding clause that's worth quoting here because the statement is just so powerful and on point. Children deserve the opportunity to grow into adulthood before making life-altering decisions about their gender and fertility. By invoking the Notwithstanding clause, we're ensuring that laws safeguarding children's health, education, and safety cannot be undone, and that parents are fully involved in the major decisions affecting their children's lives. We have been waiting years for a conservative politician in Canada who would not only say things like that, but actually mean them. Not just chuck out red meat to the base during election time and then offering social conservatives, for example, nothing when actually elected to office. And what makes this all so extraordinary is that Danielle Smith is not a social conservative. She is, quite famously, a libertarian. And throughout her career, in fact, she has clashed with social conservatives. So I remember very vividly in 2014 when she was the leader of the Wild Rose Party and she crossed the floor with the bulk of her party to the progressive conservatives and basically reduced the sort of upstart Wild Rose Party to a rural rump. And in part, her decision was made because of the influence of social conservatives in the Wild Rose Party. She said this quite openly, that social conservatives made the Wild Rose Party essentially unmanageable, and she as a libertarian was not ideologically aligned with them. So why is Smith taking a different path? Well, some of you may remember after she left politics, she went back into talk radio. She spent years talking with conservatives on the radio, taking a lot of heat for her decision to cross the floor, which made her one of the most unpopular traders in Albertan politics for years. I remember this very well. And yet she has secured this massive political comeback, and she is probably the favorite conservative leader of social conservatives because this time around, she's steering a very careful path. In the decade since her infamous betrayal, it has to be said, the LGBT agenda has gotten increasingly extreme. So it's kind of shifted from same-sex marriage to sex changes for kids. And this left many non-socially conservative, common-sense conservatives and Canadians behind. Danielle Smith saw an opportunity to create a conservative coalition that would keep social conservatives happy by delivering real results while also retaining the support of common sense Albertans. So Smith has done something that shouldn't be extraordinary, but in Canada actually is extraordinary. She has created a conservative big tent in which both libertarians and social conservatives get real legislative change. Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party, by contrast, makes it very, very clear that they want social conservatives in the tent, but off the platform. Not so for Smith's UCP. It's strange that she is one of the only major conservative politicians in the country to figure this out. The fact that a pro-choice, pro-gay libertarian is championing parental rights legislation and curbing the insanity of transgender ideology reveals that there is a broad coalition of Canadians who are awaiting a leader who supports action like this. Smith would not have moved on these issues if she was not certain that the public was on her side. And she was right. One of the reasons I was particularly encouraged by Smith coming out, putting forward these three pieces of legislation, and now defending them by invoking the Notwithstanding clause with Bill 9, is that it shows that her internal polling data indicated what we now see, which is that the vast majority of Albertans are behind her. She went up for a leadership review after passing this legislation, and at the largest political convention in the country, she got an over 90% approval rating from the members. And what's so interesting now is that Danielle Smith, again, the politician who in her previous iteration crossed the floor and left the Wild Rose Party, in part due to social conservative influences in that party, is now putting forward pieces of legislation that are getting her attacked by LGBT activists. Now, the more LGBT activists attack her, of course, the more social conservatives rally behind her and want to defend her, because nothing is going to make social conservatives, say a rural farmer in southern Alberta, sit up and want to defend Danielle Smith like watching Janice Irwin call her a bigot in the Edmonton legislature, or watching trans activists attack her from the front steps in Edmonton. Ironically, like J.K. Rowling, again, she is not a social conservative, and she is actually socially liberal on most major issues. But the LGBT movement's extremism has pushed her into an alliance with people that she strongly disagrees with on many things. And so when LGBT activist groups try to stop her common sense legislation with lawsuits, the troops rally behind her. There's one other thing I think that's really important to highlight about Danielle Smith that makes her so different. And when you talk to voters in Alberta, when you talk to politicians in Alberta, when you talk to activists in Alberta, the thing that consistently comes up is that Danielle Smith treats social conservatives like stakeholders. She actually takes them seriously. She recognizes that in her big tent, they are a faction of her voting base, and she responds to them as if they are deserving of the same attention that any other faction, any other segment of her base is. And this is something that social conservatives do not get from other conservative parties. She actually shows them respect. And this is because I believe of her years spent in talk radio, talking to Albertans. She genuinely understands their concerns. She looks at where she has common ground with them, and then she puts forward an agenda that she believes in and they believe in. Again, the LGBT movement has made this so easy. The abortion movement, for that matter, has made this incredibly easy because they are so extreme. And so Danielle Smith's move to create this conservative coalition should be modeled by other politicians across the country. And what's been interesting is to see the extent to which Canada's LGBT movement is sort of fundamentally a paper tiger. They hold a vast amount of influence, but in a very small number of institutions that have basically dominated the national discussion for years, because the national debate in this country has been limited to a handful of newspapers that only a fraction of Canadians read, and the federal conservatives and federal liberals sort of angrily agreeing with each other about every major social issue. And so the Conservative Party is basically like, the pride season with a better accountant. And there's not really an alternative. You don't really get a choice, you get an echo. You don't really get an alternative, you get the Liberals driving the speed limit. You get a party that's conserving what the Liberals left behind last time they were in office, and where they're going to pick up again when they win office again. So the UCP's decision to protect Albertan children unapologetically and explicitly refusing to cede any points to the opposition signals to Canadians that real action to combat LGBT extremism is actually possible, and that conservatives who refuse to do so are acting out of cowardice, not good politics. Meanwhile, just by way of contrast here, the newly elected Conservative Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, Tony Wakeham, celebrated Transgender Awareness Week recently on social media. Wakeham is 69 years old. That means that in all likelihood, unless he was a member of a fairly fringe LGBT group back in the day, he probably wasn't even really aware of the transgender phenomenon until he was in his 50s. I went to Simon Fraser University, one of the most left-wing campuses in Canada, and transgenderism had barely surfaced as an issue only 15 years ago. And now you've got almost 70-year-old conservative politician in the Maritimes celebrating Transgender Awareness Week. And I always think when he was in his 40s, if you had told him you're going to be defending sex changes for kids when you're an elected politician, he probably would have been angry. He probably would have said, of course not. You're libeling me. You're a bigot. You're a homophobe. I'll never support those kinds of things. And yet here he is. Like so many other Canadian conservative politicians, he transitioned. And it's genuinely pathetic to see. Premier Danielle Smith has proven that there is another way and that Canadians are in desperate need of leadership that most conservatives, including, for example, the almost entirely useless Premier Doug Ford, are simply refusing to provide. And she's drawing attention to the fact that so many of our so-called conservative premiers are actually hurting the conservative cause in Canada. Because where Tony Wakeham is sitting, where Doug Ford is sitting, that's where a real conservative should be. That's where somebody who actually believes in something and responds to the needs of their voters should actually be. But pretty much only in Alberta do they have that right now. But the good news is that Danielle Smith has unveiled a blueprint that every conservative politician in this country should be paying attention to. Thank you so much for listening to or watching the Bridgehead this week. We hope you did find it helpful. Please do share around if you did find it helpful. Like the video, subscribe. You can get our content across any podcast platform, that you use. Thanks again.